Hello, everybody. Jimmy here, Boileau, Quebec. We are a little bit east, east, west, east, west. We're east, west from Ottawa, Montreal. My brain's not working as much as it should these days. Awfully tired. Been working hard in the field. But here in Boileau, Quebec, we are west of Montreal west of Montreal about 2 hours, east of Ottawa about an hour and a half, a little bit up towards Mont Tremblant. It used to be called Sutana, Manatonga by the West-Guerini Algonquin peoples. These are their homelands. So thank you. Blessings to all. So welcome, everyone. This is the Veganic Growers Hour number 12 here in Boileau, Quebec today. It is 25 degrees. It is sunny, gorgeous. We have had just a ton of rain over the last 6 to 8 weeks, and we have fields out of the 12 gardens that we have. They're all 50 foot by 50 foot. 5 of them are completely wet still on top. So it's a very dramatic time for us here, very difficult. We were 10 days later than normal in getting our harvest in. But things are coming along. Things are finally coming along. So welcome to Peaches and Sugar from the Valley, Indigenous Veggie Sattva from the Shahi, Duwamish, and Stillaguamish lands. Claire from Scotland, welcome. And Jude from the Jardins de Napierville, welcome all. Very great to have you all here. We are thankful. We're still harvesting, even though that the fields have been all wet. We are still harvesting kale and mesclun and radishes and little white turnips or navet, garlic scapes, a lot of perennial herbs like lemon balm and oregano, winter savory. So we're having fun. We're seeing the harvest come in. It's very exciting. And some client favorites coming up here in the next couple of days are our first carrots and sugar snap peas, which are not just good for the clients, but for the clients' children. So things are moving along. So welcome to tonight's show. Tonight's show is about the greenest times, or at least they should be, and disease and or nutrient deficiencies, as well as we're going to continue our discussion about the preservation of fruits and vegetables by dehydration and freezing. So let's kick it off. So the greenest times, July. These are some of my favorite times. Usually this is when the fields are starting to become the greenest. Things are starting to grow. We've passed that warm and settled date where the risk of frost is past, and here we are in our greenest moments where the successions of all the plants that we're growing are thriving, and this is what we're all here for. This is what we're shooting for in our gardens, right? We're striving for keeping plants happy and healthy. Now, a little bit scientific. It has been claimed that there are at least 17 mineral elements that are required to keep all plants healthy and happy, all plants. To name sort of the major elements, we're talking about carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And I'm going to get into a few of these here in a second. Then the minor nutrients, but no less important than the major nutrients, are chlorine, boron, iron, manganese, copper, zinc, nickel, and molybdenum. Just like in our own bodies, if we have too much or too little of any specific mineral or element, we're not going to feel all that good. We might even come up with some sort of disease or malady that we have to deal with. So it's the same in the plant world. If a plant, from the time it's been seeded or from the time it starts growing back, if it's perennial, to the time that it's thriving, to the time that it puts out a flower, to a fruit, to a seed, if it always looks beautiful, healthy, you get beautiful, robust flowers and fruit, it goes to its seed, or you pull the seed out and they look nice and vibrant inside, say, a tomato or a cucumber or a cerise tartare, a ground cherry. Well, then you know absolutely that every single one of those major and minor elements were available for the plant. It's kind of cool how simple that really is. So a lot of them are quite fascinating and have some very interesting characteristics. Nitrogen, as we know, is very important in promoting leafy growth and the structure of chlorophyll, which is the light harvesting compound of photosynthesis, where all plants get green from. Yet, no matter how much nitrogen is in the soil or how much nitrogen can be fixed from the air molecules, it will only be allowed to be uptake by the plant if there's enough magnesium in the soil. I didn't know this until about 18 months ago. So if there isn't enough magnesium in your soil, then it really doesn't matter how much nitrogen is available. The plant will not be able to access it, because that magnesium is like a cofactor. It allows the plant, or sends the signals to the plant, to allow for the nitrogen to fix into the plant to create that light harvesting compound, or to structure that light harvesting compound. Well, copper is another interesting cofactor. So copper lives in most soils, and it is a nutrient that will actually tell the plant where all the other nutrients are needed. So we know that potassium is really important in the creating of flowers and fruits. But unless there's copper in the soil to tell the potassium where to go, it won't get there. So it's very interesting how all of these minerals and elements have to work together. One other one that I find super cool, nickel, which I don't even think about or hadn't even thought about, like I said, up to about 18 months ago when I started researching this stuff a little further and becoming more scientific in the process. Nickel is an activator of the protein urease, which is like urea, which expels excess elements out of the plant. So like us, when we have too much of something and we excrete it through our urea, the same thing happens with a plant. Now, I've never witnessed this or seen this, but I guess it would be when a plant seeps, or maybe when a plant oozes. So if it has a little bit too much of something, nickel will activate to then expel, say it's phosphorus or potassium or even nitrogen. There's too much, it'll help expel it out. So every single one of these elements works together. I just need to make a note on time while we're discussing all this for the replay. So if we think about that, if we think about how all of these elements work together, then we can think about what it is exactly that our plants need to be happy and healthy, which is really just a balanced soil. So it kind of goes back to one of my shows where I talked about compost, where I mentioned that if you have a lot of diversity in your compost, so if you're making a compost and your green matters are, say, and we use here like native flora, like when we cut the grass. So in it, there's clover and yarrow and couch grass. And all of these are perennial plants that are healthy and vibrant. So obviously they have, according to the scientific evidence, all 17 minerals and elements that the plants need. So if we decide to use that and put it in our compost, well, then we are activating our compost with all 17 minerals and elements from the green that will then break down to create our compost. So if you're only using maybe one ingredient, let's say you're just using kitchen scraps. Well, kitchen scraps are good because theoretically kitchen scraps come from vibrant vegetables. But if they're not all grown by you, we don't really know how vibrant they may be, right? They could have been vibrant. The fruits look okay, but maybe they weren't. We know that a lot of farmers, especially when we go to the grocery store, they might pump a lot of nitrogen or a lot of phosphorus into their soil to get the crop really fast to come in. So they may not actually be that healthy, but if we have healthy growing plants and we know that we're using a balanced compost, well, then we know that our kitchen scraps are going to have all the 17 elements and minerals in there. But again, even better is to use your native flora in your compost, to use those things like yarrow and clover, or to have comfrey or nettles or things like this, because even though the claim is they have a high percentage of nitrogen or high percentage of phosphorus or high percentage of, say, magnesium, they're going to have everything. They're going to have everything in there. So this to me is really fascinating. Make the most diverse compost you can make, create the most balanced soil that you can, and it'll have all minerals and elements in there that your plant needs. It is possible that there will be an imbalance, and this will most likely happen when your soils are too wet, like they've been here over the last 6 to 7 weeks, or too dry, like when I grew in Arizona. We have Susan with us from Northern California, where they don't get much rain or any rain for the months of the summertime. So when it's that dry and things go too dry, plants go too dry, then they're not going to be able to uptake the minerals and elements they need. They're going to be able to uptake some, but not all that they need. And the same thing happens when they're too wet. So when the soils are too wet, when the soils are too dry, this is when we're going to have probably the most of our nutrient deficiency problems. And I imagine in Scotland, you have this problem too, where it gets too wet at certain inopportune moments. Maybe when the plants are in their seeding process, or maybe when they're going to fruit, all of a sudden you get a lot of rain. There's not really much you can do about too much rain. Really, all that you can do is try to create a soil that's well draining. So if you live in a place that's notoriously too wet, well, then you look for a way to make your soil more well draining. If you know that you live in a place where it's too wet, you don't want to put your gardens, like unfortunately we put one of ours, in the lowest part of your field where the water can collect, because the plants don't grow. But even saying that, there might be some plants that can grow if it is too wet. We had one garden that was completely inundated. We couldn't plant it with the crops that we wanted to, so I decided to cover crop it with alfalfa, Sudan grass, which is a heat-loving grass, and oats. Interestingly, alfalfa is doing vibrantly. Oats are doing vibrantly. Don't mind it being wet. I mean, it is muddy down there. Doesn't mind it being wet. But the couch grass, not the couch grass, the Sudan grass is kind of yellowish, doesn't want to grow. It's because it likes it dry. So anyway, there are some plants, mostly we're talking about plants that are unedible for us, that even though peaches and sugar said cranberries like wet, yeah, and rice likes wet. So if you want to plant rice, you can. It just really depends on what you want to do. Me, if it's too wet space, I would just rewild it, completely put it back. And if you want to use some of that native flora in your compost, all the more better, because they'll be able to uptake all those nutrients. Now, there are some nutrient deficiencies that are very easy to correct. One of the most interesting ones, and before I even talk about the one, I do want to say that this is kind of a question from me to everyone, in that whenever I see something that I haven't seen before, when I have conditions like I have now, where it's really wet, there's sort of bacterial issues or fungal issues that I haven't seen before, I research it. This is how I answer my questions. I just type in what I see. So if I see a leaf with spots and it's on a potato, and I want to know, well, then all of a sudden I find out maybe it's a leaf spot, a bacterial leaf spot, or some sort of early blight or something like this. So if you do that, if you're curious enough, again, it always comes back to observation, doing your observation log and being curious. If you're curious enough, then you will look at those things not as, oh no, what is happening to my plant, but more like, well, what can I learn from that plant? And what's interesting is it's not just us learning from the plant, it's the plant learning from the condition. There was a research article, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the article, but it was a research article that I read a little while ago that talked about that in actuality, it's a blessing that the forests and perennial, say, grasslands get bacterial and fungal diseases from time to time because it makes them more resilient. And this is something that conventional agriculture, I don't think, will ever understand, is that by planting the way they do, by treating their fields before they plant with fungicides and then putting herbicides on all the weeds and then pesticides for all the insects, they're not allowing the plants to tap into the nutrients that they can tap into to build their own immune systems. It's incredible. It's incredible for me to think about that with all the knowledge that we supposedly have as we get older and older and older and times go on, and here we are in 2022 and we're still farming in this way that's completely awful. And yet in the end, if we would just grow non-GMO, open pollinated seeds that have been saved year after year after year, they would build up the resistance and the production would be just fine. Anyway, whole nother topic. But the point being is that all the elements reside in the soil for the plants to need. When the plant needs it, some kind of element signals to the plant to then activate to move that nutrient where it needs to go. One really interesting one is blossom end rot. A lot of people will get this on their tomatoes. You can get it on your peppers, sometimes your eggplants, but definitely in your tomatoes and peppers. And it's where sort of the bottom of the tomato turns black. What this is a lack of calcium uptake, and it's probably not that there isn't enough calcium in the soil, but that the plant is just unable to access it because, like most gardeners do, we water too much, we irrigate too much, especially we're watching the plant get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're watering, and we think we have to. Well, probably all the calcium that was needed is just getting flushed away just a little bit further than where the roots can access it. So there's a couple of things that you can do to counteract blossom end rot, because there's nothing worse than growing a beautiful tomato plant, a beautiful pepper plant. You go to look at the tomato and half of it's black. It's just unedible. It sucks. So there's a couple of things that we can do. So if you live in a place where you burn fire in your house, you can use wood ash right on the plant. As soon as you see it, and we get it from time to time, and because we grow all of our tomatoes in a sort of a caterpillar tunnel, it's kind of a small greenhouse. If we see that, and we water more than we would outside, so it's possible that we're overwatering at a certain point. Usually I back off when I see the tomatoes starting to blush, but it happens that the plant doesn't have enough calcium. So by putting wood ash right around the plant and watering after that, the calcium that's in the wood ash will automatically go into the roots, and it just gets sucked up right away. And really, almost without fail, this is kind of one of those magic bullet tricks. Without fail, the plant starts putting out tomatoes without any blossom end rot, because all of a sudden it can uptake calcium. Wood ash is interesting because not only does it have calcium, it also has it has a little bit of phosphorus, it has a lot of potassium, which is really, really excellent to make those flowers and fruits on those tomato plants. Has iron, manganese, boron, which can be tough, and copper and zinc. So boron is an interesting one because all brassica families of cultivars require boron to make a nice head, either a nice cabbage or a nice head of broccoli. If it doesn't have enough boron, what will end up happening is it'll kind of be disfigured. It's not a plant disease. It's just flat out a nutrient deficiency. It doesn't have enough boron to do what it needs to do. It's going to bring me to my point about what I believe about plant diseases in a minute. But however, so saying all this, if you are relying on your gardens for income, or it's going to be a majority of your food source and you haven't done so already, I really, really recommend a soil test. pretty much every place has one. Not everybody is into it. Some people say, oh, you don't learn anything. Don't get the recommendations. If you get a soil test, send it to me. I will help you analyze it. But don't get the recommendations from the lab. They'll tell you to put in this sulfate, that sulfide, that organic matter, that manure, whatever. Don't worry about that. The point of getting a soil test is just to see what the levels are of the minerals that they're testing for. And usually they're going to test for them all that I named, not oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. But they will test for, actually, they will test for hydrogen, and because that's the power of hydrogen, that's the pH. So we'll test for hydrogen. That's how you know your acidity levels. Anyway, but not in the same kind of way. But they will test for everything else except nickel and molybdenum. So if you have at least some in there, by adding organic matter, adding diversified compost into your soil, it's then going to help activate those other elements. It's going to bring them up. Like we saw here by putting in a lot of organic matter from plant-based sources, a lot of vegetable compost, a lot of in-bed composting of the plant materials, a lot of cover crops dying on the beds in the wintertime. What we noticed is that every single one of our levels went up. Our organic matter levels went up, our phosphorus went up, our potassium went up, everything went up. And that's just a testament to what I've learned about making diversified compost, and it works. So get a soil test. It's a snapshot. There's a couple of people out there who I've talked with that said they're going to do it every year. I think that's great. Even if you only do it every 3 years, it's great. You can go ahead and keep sort of a record and follow your progression as you're getting your garden going. It's super important to know. And that way you'll just have an idea what you're starting with. And if you haven't done it before and you have your gardens, and even if you're just kind of testing around, I can get a soil test for about $39 Canadian. It's not expensive. So very, very cool. Very, very good idea. There you go. So we're moving on to, that was nutrient deficiencies. So what about plant diseases? Where do these come from? Well, like I had just mentioned, I really do believe that a plant is going to become more diseased, and I'm going to say more diseased because in some cases, the plant has a fungus or a bacteria in its leaves. You can see it. I can see it right now. And this is really interesting. We have elm trees where they have a bacterial leaf spot, and they've had it because it's been too wet, too humid in the mornings. It's been too wet from the rain and then too humid. The milkweed, the wild milkweed, which almost never has any issues, has a rot, some sort of yellowish tinted rot, so some kind of an early blight on its bottom leaves. And some of the stems are even rotting away. Very, very, very peculiar, but makes sense because the plants couldn't uptake the nutrients that they needed to help fight off those diseases. However, saying that, not all have it, and even the ones that do have it have now put on a beautiful head of flowers, and they smell gorgeous, and the monarch butterflies are in there laying their eggs for the little caterpillars, who then become the next generation, which is going to happen here in the fall because it's that fast. It all comes down to nutrient deficiencies and the nutrients that are in the soil. So if we do have, if we're talking about plant diseases and we're talking about bacterial issues and fungal issues. Now, the bacteria that cause the problems in plants and the funguses that cause problems in plants, they basically live in all soils. Some people have told me that there are some funguses that travel by the air. Fine. So it travels by the air. No matter what, they will all end up on the plants in some way. Well, if the plants have a good balance of all the elements and nutrients that they need, then they're going to be able to thwart these diseases, even if it's strange. And thank you, Indigenous Veggie Sattva. It was good to see you. And thank you for all your comments, Claire. Very, very cool. So it is my theory that pretty much all plants that succumb to a disease would have been able to counteract that disease if they were able to uptake nutrients better. And that has to do with the way that we manage the crops. Like we know that chlorine makes plants more resistant to disease. So if the chlorine is available, it's going to make the plants more resistant. A balanced soil, a soil test, more diversified compost. It really continues to go in one big circle. It all works together. Here in Quebec, our biggest problem is that we have rain saturation at certain moments, and really I haven't found any solution for that. In dry areas, it is that there is a humidity change, usually by irrigation, and sometimes it's associated with kind of a drop in temperature, and that's going to cause issues. So it brings up two, and peaches and sugar, I don't know why your tomato leaves are turning black, but if it's a purplish black, then that means I want to say that it's an uptake issue with, I want to say potassium, but it could be phosphorus. But it depends. If it's on the tips, it's one thing. And if it's the whole leaf, that's the other thing. But if it's a purplish black, then it's absolutely a nutrient uptake issue. And you just want to research it. I don't know completely offhand which one it is, but I think it's either phosphorus or potassium. But you can Google that. My tomato plants have leaves turning black, and it'll tell you. So two of the ones that have given me whole leaf black, okay. I don't know. Google that, see what it comes up with, and then you can let us know. I would have to do the same because I don't know. I've never seen one of my tomato plants have a whole leaf black. The two biggest ones that I've seen here, and I had one of them also in Arizona, which was really dry in comparison to here that was really wet. But the one that's been giving me all sorts of interesting challenges is what's called white mold. Now, white mold affects over 400 different species of plants. It will go after glycine, physalis, so it'll go after the soybeans, will go after the bush beans, the dry beans. It'll be prevalent in peppers, not so much tomatoes, but peppers. It's been in eggplants. I've seen it in tomatillos, which is another Solanaceae. So it is a bad one. And what it does is a fungus usually brought on by wet and humid. So I never had it in Arizona because it was really never wet and humid. And it's basically a white fungus, and it surrounds the plant, kind of eats the stem. And when you open up a stem that's completely infected, or because it'll cause total mortality, when you open up the stem, there's like these little black, like fungal bodies in there. It's really wild, but it's like little black eggs of fungus. Last year, and I started getting it in 2017. Now, our soils are pretty well embedded. They're not exceptionally well draining, which can cause us some problems. And it's probably why the white mold is here, because there are times if we get late rains in July or August and it gets wet, then that white mold is going to show up more. But what I notice is that even if white mold ends up in, say, one of my runs of dry beans or bush beans or in my peppers, by pulling out the infected plant, which is always a pretty good practice if it's dead, and you may want to think about this, peaches and sugar, about your whole leaf black, you may want to cut the leaves out. Now be careful, because you can spread fungus and bacteria by the use of snips. So if you're going to do that, don't use them for anything else until you go ahead and sterilize them after, put them in hot boiling water or whatever. But you can always try to cut the leaf out. So white mold, what I noticed, which was really interesting last year, is when it got really wet, the white mold was there, but then we got really, really dry and hot. And the white mold just seemed to kind of bake away. it was still on the plants that it was on, but it didn't spread. And I pulled out a few plants and I put them into the other native flora so they could go eat it. And wouldn't you know, it kind of went away. So with every issue, even if it becomes very pervasive, like this one can be, and the plants can't grow out of it because there are certain things that they can't grow out of. You can cut some of it out. I've done that with peppers. I was able to cut some of it out, and then the rest of the pepper would grow. So it is possible that given a little help, the plant can survive certain issues like this white mold. But with the drying temperatures, it went away. Then I saved the seed from the ones that didn't get it. We're going to talk about this in next week's show, about letting plants go to flower, go to seed, and saving them. This is the reason why we need to continue to save seeds, and we need to continue them so that the plants can develop their resilience and their resistances, and we can save those seeds to replant so that those plants have resilience and resistances. It's pretty simple process. It just takes time and taking money away from big agriculture. There's my rant for the day. Take money away from Bayer Monsanto. Give it to the small farmers who are saving seeds. Well, there you go. Please do that. Okay, that's one of them. The other one that I've had that I've pretty much seen everywhere in my travels and my workings throughout North America is powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is usually brought on by extreme drought, which is really interesting. This is why I had it in Arizona. It was always very drought. But when it's really dry, when the air is really, really dry, this powdery mildew kind of clicks into the plant. It comes up from the soil, it leaches on, and we would get it in our cucurbits and our squashes and winter squashes, zucchinis and winter squashes. Here we can get it also in our winter squashes. It gets exacerbated when we then have high humidity or lots of irrigation, and coupled with that temperature drop. So in Arizona, I just watered regularly every morning because it was so warm during the day. Everything would need water all day. With our sandy soils, we didn't really have any choice. That powdery mildew would just go and expand and expand and expand. Well, here in Quebec, if I notice that the powdery mildew is there, obviously I stop irrigating. It's usually not the same issue. And the powdery mildew just seems to go away eventually on its own. The plants become resistant to it. This is very cool stuff. So given the opportunity, again, this is observational experience. Given the opportunity, a plant wants to grow. It wants to thrive. It wants to produce its fruits, and it wants to produce its seeds, because that makes the plant do what it wants to do, which is reproduce, right? So whenever I have something that comes up like a tomato leaf black, and Claire has a question here, we have a similar problem with mildew in the greenhouse. We've been trying to ventilate better to reduce the problem. Yeah, that's it. We'll do the same thing with our tomato plants. Since we have them in the tunnels, it is possible that with a lower temperature, high humidity, we'll start getting sort of a verticillum wilt on the bottom leaves. Well, normally this tends to happen right when the plant is starting to fruit quite prolifically, and this is the time we don't want that plant to obviously succumb to disease. So we will do the same thing. We'll ventilate better, so we'll keep the tunnels more open, but we'll also pull the bottom leaves off that are all sitting on the ground. We'll actually allow more airflow to come in, because even though these wilts, and probably in your case, Claire, with the mildew, it's in the soil, by allowing the air to come through, it's going to change the dynamic of what's going on with that mildew. It's going to help it dry out. Now, I know in places where it's really, really heavy humidity, that's tough to do. Sometimes you can use fans. I have a fan that I put in my greenhouse anytime it goes over 17 degrees, and that pretty much eliminates any mildew problems from our high humidity that I will ever have on my beans. We grow climbing beans, and our tomatoes that are in the greenhouse are small determinate cherry tomatoes. So that works really well using a fan, and yes, ventilating is perfect. That's exactly it. Kind of changing the environment a little bit to get rid of some of these funguses out of the way. So those were my questions from me to you. So that's what I think about plant diseases and nutrient deficiencies. But I really believe this, and I think I will always really believe this, that if the plant has everything it needs, just like we as vegans have everything that we need, if we're getting all the minerals and elements we need, then we have a better chance of staying healthy. Well, the same as with a plant. I don't really think I need to tap on that anymore. I'm going to go ahead and answer a couple of questions that talk about some things from last time, but they're insect things, and then we'll go on to preservation. I'm glad I have quite a bit of time for that because that's cool. But I have two questions. One is about native flora. This is from Laura in Miami, Florida. She said, what should I do about nut sedge? Getting the feeling I should not try to eradicate it since it is native flora and beneficial. So nut sedge actually is a nitrogen fixing grass. It's very, I hate to say invasive because it's a native, but it's very adaptable. Let's say that. It enjoys many different environments throughout the south part of North America, and I think even into Mexico and Central America, but can become so root bound that it won't allow the other smaller plants to access the nutrients it needs. So what Laura was saying is that she lets the nut sedge go in her orchards, but she's been pulling it out of her garden spaces to make room for her seedlings and her little seeds in her garden, because of course it's going to take over. And our conversation and kind of my advice to that is, yeah, if you're trying to plant little seeds, you're going to need to have a nice clean bed to do so, or a plot. I've talked about this before. And while it's growing, you're still going to need to keep it pretty clean before the nut sedge comes in. But if you get a tomato plant that's 5, 6, 7, 8 feet tall, or you have your potatoes in there and all of a sudden there's some nut sedge that comes in, I don't really see it to be a big problem. You can look at it in a couple of different ways. You can try to eradicate it completely in the small space you are. And this really has anything to do with any kind of native flora that you're trying to plant through or with. Me, unless it can take it, and our particular one up here is couch grass, which has really long root systems, really an adaptable plant. We're going to try to keep it out of our beds as long as possible, but it's living right next to the bed. So if we have the end of the bed, it's just there. So it's still thriving. It's still thriving in the gardens because it's super important, and its roots are even going in. But the main body of the plant, and I guess this is the best way to answer the question, Laura, the main body of the plant is actually a little bit away from your garden space. So in your green strips or in a wild portion of your gardens, so that when the sort of smaller little nut sedge comes up, well, you just pull it off. It's not going to kill it, but it's going to kind of push it back to where you don't want it, because our growing seasons are short. Now in Miami, you have a 365-day growing season, so you might be planting all the time. And I remember from my time working in Hawaii and Central America, weeding was a everyday job. So you just have to figure out a way to manage it for the places you are. And in my particular experience, in my opinion with this, is try to keep your plots a little smaller. Instead of making really long plots like we can do here, because maybe we don't have as much native flora pressures, try to keep your plots maybe a little bit smaller, and that might work pretty well. There's your answer. We also were having a very interesting discussion over the last couple of days with me and Ian Tolhurst, and I think her name was Qiang He. and Eden were all discussing about aphids. And Ian Tolhurst was very interesting in that he said that he has never, in his 20 acres, in his 40 years growing veganically, he has never had economic loss from aphids ever. So that means that even though the aphids might be there, they have never caused him any kind of economic loss to a crop. So he never lost anything to do to aphids. I guess I just said that 3 times. Excuse me. Like I said, I was sorry. So I have twice here, and I used to get it a lot in Arizona, but every single time farmer error was the culprit. Here it's been twice in 2017 and 2020. It's been my sort of late summer sowings of winter radish, watermelon radish, and purple top turnip. Now these are all brassica family. The radishes are raffinus, but the turnip is a brassica rapa. And aphids love the humid conditions of summer, and they love to eat on these specific plants. There is a way to manage them so that they don't cause any kind of economic loss, or in say a gardening sense, so that there is no kind of loss of foods that you want to eat. And that is building more diversity. Again, diversity. It's so cool how this all works. So if you have a diversity of native flora around, if you have a diversity of plants, you're going to have predator insects that like to eat aphids, or that are going to corral the aphids into a certain space. I definitely talked about this on the last show about aphids. But it's super important. It's super important to create that diversity. Even if you use, like we do here, we use insect screen to block so that flea beetles aren't a problem. If you keep on the insect screens, or I think what Quinning, I'm saying her name wrong and I'm very sorry, talked about using floating row covers. Well, if you leave it on too long, you're going to create even more humid environment that the aphids really, really enjoy, and you're going to have even more aphids to eat on your plants. And if an aphid eats on your plants, then they're just going to start sucking the life out of the leaves. That's just really what they do. Doesn't mean that you're not going to get a harvestable turnip or radish, or whatever the crop is, or kind of a winter green, but it may stunt the growth underneath. So if you are using those things, just make sure you manage them. When the foliage gets too big, you want to pull it off so you give airflow, that Claire mentioned, which is super important. More insect diversity to come in, and by planting more plant diversity, you're going to have the entire cycle of the insect population to come in and take care of everything else. So there's the answer to that discussion. It was a great discussion. I love those discussions on Facebook, how we can go around and around and around. Talking about preservation. So we've done all this work. We're getting these herbs and these vegetables and these fruits to come in. What's the best way to do so? And I talked a little bit about drying last time, and we'll start there because it got cut really short. So we dry, and I have my little list. We dry every year. Think of a liter jar or a quart if you're from the States. A liter of nettles, 2 liters of mint, 1 liter of oregano, 2 liters of lemon balm, 2 liters of chamomile flowers, half a liter of thyme, of clover, basil. We do 3 liters of sacred basil or holy basil. We do another half a liter of marjoram, cereate or savory, rosemary, and those are the herbs that we do. On top of that, we do 3 to 4 liters of cherry tomatoes, 2 to 3 liters of summer and winter squash, or summer squash and zucchini. And this year we want to try to save 8 to 10 liters of ground cherries, which is really, when it dries, it's really like a raisin, which I put in my granola in the morning. It's a really, really awesome dried fruit. Also in season, when we can get them or find them, would be we dry mushrooms, wild mushrooms, apples, and pears. Now, drying. Some people, well, there are many different methods out there about drying. And Melanie took some herbology classes, and I studied herbs also. And what she told me, what Melanie told me from her classes, which makes a lot of sense, is that the faster and at the right temperature, especially an herb, a medicinal herb or a culinary herb dries, the more nutritive properties it's going to contain. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to kind of harness the harvest. Ooh, I really like that word. Harness the harvest. Harness the harvest. Harness the nutrient in the harvest so that when we use it, after we dry it, we put it in, and we put everything in like mason jars. When we open it, you still smell what it smelled like when it was fresh. And actually it's more potent, it's more pungent. You need to, when you use dry, you need to use a lot less than when you use fresh. It's just the way it works. So the right temperature is important, and the amount of time is important. So there are older methods, non-electrical methods or non-solar use methods of drying by hanging in a really dry place or putting it into your oven. Maybe turn your oven on a little bit, turn it off, let it cool down almost to where there's no heat at all, but then put it in, let it dry. The best method I have found, it seems to be the most efficient of all those ways, especially if you live in a place where it gets humid in your house, and here it's humid all summer in our house, is to have a dehydrator. And a dehydrator will blow a fan as well as have a little bit of heat, so it's going to dry very efficiently. And my favorite, and somebody pointed out last show when we talked about this, was they're very expensive, and they are. But to me, considering the list that I just mentioned, and I don't know how many people out there try to buy organic dried herbs, but if I think of like a liter jar, I don't know how much that weighs. Let's say it's 100 grams. It's probably a little bit more than that, but let's say it's 100 grams. If I'm thinking of, say, mint, and I'm looking for organic mint, it's not even veganic mint, but just organic mint, it's going to cost something in the neighborhood of $15 to $17 to $18 per 50 grams. So what I'm drying is about $37, $38 worth of herbs, right? Of dried herbs. And that list that I gave you is pretty much what we'll go through in a year. Sometimes we'll have a little bit left over, but this is really what we're going to go through in a year. So holy basil, great example. 3 liters of holy basil at 5, and if it's 50 liters, yeah, Antonio, I've had my Excalibur 20 years now, still going. Yeah, absolutely. Those things last forever. They're amazing. Good for you. I'm glad you still have it. I'm glad it's still running. That's amazing. And that's the thing when you buy something, that it's kind of like buying a Vitamix. There's a lifetime warranty. I think even Excalibur has a lifetime warranty. It's going to cost you quite a bit of money to get going. But okay, so back to holy basil. 3 liters, say it's 300 grams. Holy basil is like $20 for 50 grams. So times that by 6 and $120 worth of basil. So in 1 year, I don't know what I paid for my Excalibur 9 years ago. I think maybe I paid $350 for it. In 1 year, it's paying for itself, not even including the cherry tomatoes and the ground cherries and all that. So think about this kind of thing. Again, if this is more of a homesteading or trying to grow all the food that you can, trying to preserve as much of the harvest as you can, if this is what you're trying to do, you're going to find uses for it. And Claire asks, I didn't know that it was practical. Absolutely, it's practical. It's amazing because if you make spaghetti sauce, you put it in your spaghetti sauce. I like to put it in my tofu brulee, my like tofu scrambles. I like to put it in if I do like chickpea omelets. So yeah, dried basil is awesome. You can use it for anything. We make pizza in the wintertime. Use it, just put it right on top of your pizza before you bake it in the oven. So yeah, like basil, you can do like your own Italian seasoning mix with dried basil, oregano, marjoram, mix them all together. And the great thing is most of these, other than basil, are either self-seeding annuals or perennials. So they're going to come back year after year. And even if the harvest isn't fantastic, there's always going to be some. And if you have your dehydrator there, then you can go ahead and dehydrate. Well, there you go. So that's my pitch for dehydrating. Now, I've always wanted to create, and I'm still going to do this one time, I've always wanted to create an outside solar dehydrator because I just find it cool. And there are models out there you can research online about how to do it with sort of like like an old glass, sliding glass door, some people make cold frames with them, or old window. But there is a way to make a solar dehydrator. Here, we just have such a problem with humidity. I would really have to pick a day, but I think that would be cool. But I know that the Excalibur, maybe Antonio, you can attest to this. I know that the Excalibur, it doesn't use that much electricity. And like, even if I had to have solar, I think I would create, and there was no electricity, all of a sudden we were off grid, I think I would create a solar panel just to run the dehydrator. Because it's that efficient, and I think it would work. So that's about drying. And I'm sure there's other things. I mean, drying fruits, drying things like peppers, supposedly is really good. You can dry carrots and onions and celery. We cold store those things, and we're going to talk a lot more about cold storage here coming in late August. But you can dry those things and just make sort of dried soup mixes ready to go. You have your dried carrots, your dried celery, your dried peppers, and your dried onions. You pretty much have everything that you need to reconstitute to start a soup base. So these are things to think about. And these are also really good things to do with everything. Like, there's been times where all of a sudden you had so many little carrots that, they're really, really small that maybe I would have just left them into the field. But now I take them all out. I take everything out of the field, everything that I can. And we use it in some way or another. Because even small carrots, I mean, we can cold store carrots from September all the way until almost June. Well, in May, it's awfully nice to have those little small carrots. They're not really good to eat fresh, but they're really good to put into soups. That's my pitch on dehydrating. If you're into it, get an Excalibur. I used to have a round one. I don't remember what those are called. It was fine. It was efficient enough, but there's nothing like the Excalibur. They come in 9 tray, and I think it's either 5 or 7 tray, which is the smaller version. Either way, it doesn't matter. Completely washable. Like I said, I think it will last a lifetime. Moving on. So let's talk about freezing. This is another of my absolute favorite methods of preservation. Kind of like drying and the dehydrator, that if I happen to have, hold on, Antonio mentioning something. Round ones don't last. There you go. So buy the Excalibur, the round dehydrators don't last. There's the pitch. Thank you, Antonio. So freezing. So I have a stand-up freezer, as well as I have a freezer on top of my fridge, but we have a stand-up freezer that was given to us, which was very cool by my parents-in-laws, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, parents-in-laws. That's weird. I don't think I've ever said that word. Anyway, so we have the freezer, and we fill it pretty much complete, packed at the end of every season. So what are we freezing? Well, I'm not going to go into everything that we go into, but I'm going to talk about the stuff that we have now. And right now is the small fruit time. So anybody who lives, and there's a few people out there who live in Canada, this is the time for strawberries. This is getting to be the time for raspberries. We're really soon jumping on the time of cultivated blueberries, and in about another month and a half, we're going to have wild blueberries. So this is the majority of our freezing that we do, and all of those little fruits make a wonderful addition to our cereals or our smoothies. And some people are really into making jams, and I'm into canning too. There's certain things that I think that there's no substitute to canning, but I also thought that canning small fruits was a good idea into jam and conserves or preserves. But what I realized is that, and maybe you've done this also, that when you start doing your preservation, because you have such a plethora of something, you make a certain thing, like say bread and butter pickles or strawberry preserves, and you realize you just don't eat that much strawberry preserves. Like, I eat pancakes and we eat waffles, and I love to have the jam on there. But if I put any more than 4 or 5 jars up, if say 125 milliliter jars up, then I don't eat it all. I just don't eat that much jam. However, let's say I want jam and I've just frozen all the fruits. Well, you take those frozen fruits out, you put them in your little pot, and you boil it down, and you make jam. Sort of a volonté, sort of as you go, which is really, really cool. You don't need to. But me, I like eating that frozen fruit. I was a kid who used to freeze grapes when I lived in California, and I used to just eat the frozen grapes in the middle of summer. Well, I just love the taste of frozen fruit. I love frozen blueberries. I love frozen blackberries. I love frozen strawberries. I love frozen raspberries. And I love to just put it right on top of my granola, which is pretty much what I eat every morning. We make our own granola, stovetop granola even, which I'll talk about at some point. And I like to put that frozen fruit right on top. Even if there's stuff that I trade for or I buy, like let's say sometimes we buy organic fair trade bananas. Banana is an awesome substitute for applesauce, for your sort of your wet ingredient to your binding ingredient to act like an egg, which obviously all of us know we don't need. And so I'll use that frozen banana. I'll have those frozen bananas in there. So when I want to make my zucchini muffins from, say, the zucchini that I shredded, because here soon, not only are we drying zucchini and with summer squash, we're going to also grate it because we love zucchini muffins. And frozen fruit for smoothies, of course, is the best. So freezing takes up almost no space. It's really easy. It absolutely is the best way to preserve the flavor of the ripest fruit. We also like to freeze rhubarb, and this is a brilliant recipe. It's not even a recipe, but a brilliant idea. I had no idea. This is a friend of mine, Mary-Eve Severia, who wrote a book, Les Saisons de Légumes. It's only in French. So anybody out there speaking French, if you're still out there and you don't know that book, you should get it. It's very, very cool. She had an idea for rhubarb, that you freeze the rhubarb by cutting it, which we do, and it's super small. And you then go ahead and use it as rhubarb ice in your water. And because it's in that same family as sorrel, it kind of has those same antioxidants as sorrel. Supposedly sorrel, and I think rhubarb is pretty close, they have almost more antioxidants than Japanese green tea. So basis all the time in May and June, I'm pretty exhausted from working pretty much every day. And I tried this because I had the book and I was talking with her by email about some other things. And I was like, I wonder what else I could do with rhubarb. And I put the ice right in my water bottle. I started drinking it, and it has that sort of lemony flavor. I mean, if you eat rhubarb, I like to eat rhubarb, but some people find it a little bit too much. But you put it in the water and it just filters in, and it creates like a rhubarb lemonade. I mean, you could even make a rhubarb lemonade, which is really cool. And you put the rhubarb in with your water and a little bit of sugar, a little bit of maple syrup, or whatever you use. But just the rhubarb ice in the water is incredible. And to make rhubarb jam later, or rhubarb strawberry jam later. I've even made like rhubarb strawberry cobbler from all the frozen fruit. So if you like I love cobbler. I'm all about cobbler. I love apple cobbler or apple brown Betty, and apple cobbler, rhubarb cobbler. So there you go. So the freezing everything. There's so many different ideas. Peaches and Sugar asks what about freezing herbs? The one I like the best is parsley. I just basically pull, if it's curly parsley, I just kind of pull off the curly part, and I just pack it just like that. That's my favorite. I do cilantro only because we can our own salsa, and so we need cilantro, and sometimes the cilantro that we need when everything is coming in doesn't come in with the peppers and the hot peppers and the tomatoes. So then I'll use the frozen cilantro, but it kind of turns blackish. I don't really like using it, but parsley is my favorite. I tried doing chives, didn't really like it. Basil doesn't work, but Then again, now if you're talking about basil, and this was the other thing I was saying, for us that are growing garlic in the north that have the garlic scapes, you can make your garlic scape pesto or your basil pesto and freeze that. And that's the best way for me in my idea to freeze herbs instead of actually drying them. That's what I have. We're going to talk a lot more about preservation as it goes on. So just so everybody knows what's coming up. So coming up soon, if you're anywhere in the neighborhood within a few hours or maybe even a day's drive, it's worth it. I'm kidding. Our veganic kiosk is open in Boileau starting tomorrow. So if you want to come get veganic veggies here, we're open every Friday until the 16th of September. Next show is all about the art of harvesting and the harvest in the full swing. So I'm going to give you tips. We're going to give you tricks, the best way to know about harvesting, that it is truly an art form, like a well-crafted masterpiece. If you're into all that, after all of that hard work and knowing the best time to go ahead and harvest all your fruits, veggies, and herbs, that's the show for you as well. So as always, thank you so very much for joining me and joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you all out there with your comments and your questions. I enjoyed this quite a bit. So I thank you, and I wish you all a wonderful couple of weeks. Peace to all beings on this heaven that we call Earth. Thank you, and have a good night.